Presentation of Dialogue on Idaho Public Television is made possible through the generous support of the Laura Moore Cunningham Foundation, committed to fulfilling the Moore family's legacy of building the great state of Idaho.
Coming up, an Arab Spring in Tunisia and Egypt, and then an Arab summer in Libya. What's causing the tumult in the Middle East, and is it good for the United States? And what about Iran? I talk with an expert on the Middle East next on Dialogue. Hello and welcome to Dialogue. I'm Marcia Franklin. When a Tunisian street vendor set himself on fire to protest his treatment by a police officer, little did anyone know that it would spark a revolutionary movement, one that would spread to Egypt, Bahrain, Libya, and other countries. People there are calling for an end to autocratic rule. But what's causing the uprisings, and what effect might they have on the United States? And what about Iran, where a so-called Green Revolution in 2009 didn't succeed? Suzanne Maloney studies the Middle East in her work as a scholar at the Brookings Institution. Maloney, a former member of the U.S. State Department's policy planning staff, was also the project director of a task force on the Council on Foreign Relations that looked at U.S. policy towards Iran. I spoke with her at the 2011 Sun Valley Writers Conference. Since 1995, the conference has been bringing together authors and artists to share their works and address issues of national and international importance. I started by asking Ms. Maloney to reflect on the rapid changes occurring in the Middle East.
I think it's been a dramatic and unpredictable and truly exciting moment in the Middle East, a historic moment that certainly very few anticipated. And I think at this stage, even fewer can predict where it will go. But we've seen, real achievements that will improve, I think, the quality of life and the American interests in the region as well, in a way that will be enduring. And I think, we're going to have to work very closely with a number of governments to ensure that the transition process in Egypt and Tunisia goes well. We now have on our hands potentially an opportunity to build a new future in Libya, which is going to require an enormous amount of investment, both in terms of political time and capital, but also in terms of economic reconstruction, because the country has now been devastated by months of bombardment by NATO, as well as an effective civil war on the ground.
Why are we seeing so much activity in these countries? We had the Arab Spring. This is kind of almost an Arab summer in a way. What's going on that's creating so much foment?
There was obviously an enormous amount of frustration pent up, particularly among young Arabs, and about 60% of the entire region is under the age of 30. This is a very young population, and they suffer disproportionately from some of the economic problems of this part of the world. Despite the great riches in oil resources and other resources in some parts of the region, overall the Arab region has not grown at the same pace that some other parts of the world have grown, has not seen the kind of trickle-down effect of the wealth that has come in as a result of high oil prices to broad swaths of the population. And so you had a situation of young Arabs, many of whom can't find jobs, can't start their lives by getting married and getting housing on their own, who felt as though, this sort of true humiliation and true sense of frustration over corruption and the lack of accountability just obviously struck a chord in so many.
But we can't assume, can we, that, for instance, whatever government replaces Mubarak will be necessarily allied with the United States. It could be an Islamist government, could it not? Certainly Israel is concerned because of the lack of security in the Sinai right now.
I think there's obvious reasons to be concerned about what shape all of these governments will take over the course of forthcoming years. We now have a kind of opening, and in that opening, as we know, as we've seen from other examples, other historical examples, like the Iranian Revolution in 1979, a democratic opening, the mobilization of millions looking for a government with greater freedom can actually produce an opportunity to be exploited by those who have no interest in freedom and have no interest in creating a better life for their people. So it's entirely possible that we can see really negative outcomes. I think at this stage, there's reason to be cautiously optimistic about at least Egypt and Tunisia, because they're countries with at least some sense of political competition, and there are Islamist parties that will no doubt get into the fray, and that will be a part of the political debate, but it will not be the totality of the political debate. And I think the presence and the importance of young, largely secular, young people in this protest movement is going to be a really important force, as well as, at least in Egypt, the important role of the military in guiding the process of transition. Again, that doesn't necessarily mean we're going to see a democratic or a pro-American outcome.
I want to ask you in a moment about Iran, a country that you've studied for quite a while, but briefly back to Libya. What is our interest, what has been our interest and NATO's interest in intervening in this country? Besides oil?
Well,
or is it just oil?
No, I don't think it's, I think oil is actually quite a secondary, if that, interest in terms of U.S. concerns about the fate of Libya. There was obviously a tremendous sense that there was just a humanitarian crisis occurring, and one that the world had an opportunity to forestall before it became too brutal and too deadly. And I think that was clearly a motivating factor for some of the advisors to President Obama, as well as for President Sarkozy in France. But perhaps more importantly was the European interest in ensuring that North Africa did not become a hotbed for either Islamic extremism, terrorism, or simply a place where millions of refugees would suddenly begin flooding European borders. And so I think it was the European interest and the proximity that has really driven the role of NATO and driven what I see as an inadvertent intervention on the part of a U.S. administration that really had no interest in another war in the Middle East.
Well, it'll be interesting to see who these rebels really are and whether they can form a solid government.
I think it's going to be a really rocky process. I mean, clearly this opposition council is one of limited political experience, and it's unclear whether they have national interests or tribal interests at heart. And Libya doesn't have a history of really strong political institutions. I mean, this was a one-man state, not even a one-party state. And so it will be very difficult to build a functioning state and a truly representative government in Libya.
And has the role of social media in all of these uprisings been overstated, about right?
I think it is tremendously important. I think it is also important to recognize that it is neither the precipitant nor the answer to areas where we continue to see repressive rule like Iran. The internet isn't going to free the world, but it does create opportunities. Facebook provided a platform for many of the Egyptian activists, pro-democracy activists, to coordinate their activities, to sort of strategize how to deal with likely repression and with what they were finding on the ground. Twitter provided an opportunity for everyone across the region
in
to
the world
comment.
too.
Yeah, I mean, and what is so interesting, I think, if you look at the Twitter feeds, is some of it was coming out of the Tahrir Square and some of these other places where the protests were ongoing, but much of it was happening in other parts of the Arab world. There were people in Abu Dhabi and elsewhere in Beirut who were providing a lot of the commentary and who were passing on news that they were hearing from others. And so it was this conduit for information. And I think it's also important to stress, even though it's probably not quite as sexy as the social media and the internet issue, the very fundamental role of Al Jazeera and of satellite television, without which I think we would not have seen the very rapid expansion of what was originally sort of a protest movement in a small city of Tunisia to the rest of the Arab world. The fact that Al Jazeera picked up these protests, covered them so intensively, and gave everyone in the Arab world a sense that they had a front row on history. I think that is probably the most important factor in providing a kind of contagion effect for what's happened.
Well, let's move to Iran, a country that you've studied for several decades. Even before the Arab Spring, we saw the so-called Green Revolution in June 2009 in Iran. It did not have the results that we've seen in Egypt or Tunisia. And maybe you could talk a little bit about that, what the difference is.
It must be difficult for Iranians to watch what's happening across the Arab world right now because, they've been there and done that a couple of times now, both in 1979, when millions of Iranians came to the streets peacefully to oust a pro-American autocrat who was considered very stable, And then again, most recently in June 2009, when millions again came out to protest their Islamic government and to protest what they saw as a rigged election on behalf of President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad for a second term. That movement did not produce a change in government, and it did not produce even a liberalization or a moderation. It resulted in increased repression and a consolidated hold on the Islamic Republic by the conservative faction of what has long been a really divided and contentious political elite in the Islamic Republic.
But do you see the difference because, in Egypt, our government could say to Mubarak, back off, we have a relationship with him. Is that one of the differences? We just don't have any influence at all in Iran, or do you see other factors as well that made the difference between success and failure?
Well, certainly, I think the question of the constraints on some of the pro-American autocrats in Egypt, Tunisia, and elsewhere in terms of the use of force against their own populations, they were constraints not simply imposed by their need to retain a reasonably positive image in the international community, but also by their own militaries who were unwilling at a certain point to continue firing on protesters.
Egypt's military, in this case, sided with the
eventually
protesters.
Flipped after killing 800 Egyptians, which is a not insignificant number. What's interesting in Iran is that there obviously aren't similar constraints. They're not concerned about whether the rest of the world considers them to be an egregious violator of human rights. But they've also used relatively more limited force. In the aftermath of the June 2009 elections, the best estimates of the death toll are somewhere in the range of about 100 people, which is significantly lower than either what we've seen in Egypt, Tunisia, or obviously Libya and elsewhere across the region where we've seen dictators really crack down enormously hard. The Iranians, because they've been there, because they've lived through the process of revolution and they know the escalatory impact of firing on protesters, have been much savvier, much more insidious, truly nefarious about the way that they've gone about trying to depoliticize the population, force many of the leaders of the reform movement and the sort of newfound Green Movement opposition either into exile, into prison, or silence them by intimidating relatives and reaching out. It's a a more mafia kind of campaign. They don't need.
They can shut down technology more easily too. They've
done that as well. They've sought to impose new restrictions. They've also looked for ways to buy off the population by engaging in a fairly significant subsidy reform program that involves payments to every Iranian citizen.
It's fascinating, isn't it? They've locked people's bank accounts and then opened them up and put about $70, $80 in the bank accounts?
It's about $40 a month, and it comes in 2-month installments. And obviously, at the same time, they've raised prices on a lot of key commodities. But by putting money in the hands of people, in some cases, it has resulted in a cash bonanza for Iranians of limited means.
And many, many people work for the government, so upsetting the status quo is probably not in their interest as well.
I think there's also a sense of Iranians feeling as though they really need a clear strategy for political change, in part because their expectations have been dashed so disappointingly in '79 and again more recently. So I think Iranians at this point seem to be indicating that they're not willing to go back to the streets unless they feel confident that there's going to be a real strategy for changing the nature of this government. If not the regime itself, then at least its willingness to permit political participation on the part of the people.
Now, when you study a country like this that is we have no diplomatic relations with, how do you get your information as a scholar?
At this point, the difficulty is that you're forced to rely on the internet where there's an enormous amount of information, limited contacts with people in Iran, limited in part because it's important not to taint them or in any way endanger them by association with my think tank in particular, which has been dubbed an enemy of the state by the Intelligence Ministry, along with a number of other American and international institutions. And also the vast number of Iranians who have left the country. Many leaders of the reform movement, political party leaders and others are now resident around the world. And you'd be amazed how much information is available, in part because what the reform movement did in the late 90s in lieu of creating parties, because there isn't just a real history of parties and there isn't a good framework for political parties in Iran. They invested really in newspapers, and journalism was really a political business. And so there are thousands of journalists, and it's a kind of journalistic political culture. And so there's a lot of information out there.
Americans hear a lot about Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, the president, but the real person who has power is the supreme leader. You've written that the declining power of the president is in some ways a detriment for the United States, because he actually wanted to have conversations about the nuclear issue.
I think to the extent that we were hoping to have any kind of negotiating process, Ahmadinejad worked to our advantage. He had a personal stake, quite surprisingly, given some of his truly horrific rhetoric and the grandstanding that he's done on issues like Israel and the Holocaust and others. But Ahmadinejad also saw the political benefits to potentially posturing as the individual who was able to triumph in healing what had been this long estrangement, and one that, I think most Iranians from across the political spectrum would prefer to see ended. And so he, in fact, all evidence had been agitating for some sort of interim confidence-building measures on the nuclear issue. There was an initial deal struck, apparently with his support, in the fall of 2009. It was one that the regime then walked away from, and it has been impossible, really, to revive any sort of serious track on the nuclear negotiations since.
That was my next question, is where we are. So we seem to be stalled in that arena, and meanwhile, presumably, they're moving forward with the process of ultimately enriching.
They are. They have thousands of centrifuges spinning, and their program continues. It has been impaired to some extent by both the sanctions process, which make it more difficult to get components and technology, by some of the covert programs that we've seen. We can only assume have some connection to Western governments, both this Stuxnet computer virus that's gotten a lot of press, as well as apparent killings of Iranian scientists involved in the nuclear sector. So the program has been slowed, but it does continue. And I think at this stage, it's almost impossible to imagine an Iranian government that would bargain away its nuclear advantage, given the regional instability and really given the precedent that Libya presents, a country that had in fact conceded all of its nuclear program in hopes of creating a different relationship with the West. Obviously, that kind of a concession didn't save Muammar Gaddafi's regime from NATO bombardment and eventually collapse.
How close do you think we've been to Israel taking some sort of action in Iran?
I'm always a skeptic in that regard, not because I disbelieve the statements made by every Israeli politician across the board about the existential threat that they perceive from Tehran and its nuclear program, but because I am convinced that the Israelis appreciate how much worse their own security issues may become if they take military action against the Iranian nuclear program. Iran has long tentacles. It has the ability to retaliate against Israel in tremendously damaging ways and against the rest of the world. That said, the Israelis have said, and those whom I work with who study Israel have persuaded me that if they feel there is no other option, that the process of slowing the program and amplifying political change in Iran is not moving fast enough. If there is no other alternative, Israel will take action.
How has the fall of Saddam Hussein helped Iran and the Shiites?
Well, they have now a permanent ally, I think, in the part of Iraq, and they have the removal of Saddam removed the single most important existential threat for the Iranian regime. All of the leadership of the Islamic Republic were really molded by the experience of the 8-year war with Iraq, and it was this kind of crucible that formed all of their views of the world, this distrust of negotiations and skepticism about the utility or the integrity of international institutions like the United Nations. And so to have suddenly a regime in Iraq which will as long as there's any shred of democracy, always remain one in which the Shia have a dominant role, simply because of their proportion of the population. That's something that the Iranians gives them a huge boost in their confidence and a sense of strategic depth that I think gives them a cushion against potential change in Syria.
Now, is there any effect at all of the capture of bin Laden on Iran, our relations with Iran?
I don't think it's likely to really change the nature of the game. One element which has become, I think, important is the willingness of the U.S. government to go on the record with allegations about Iran's continued involvement with al-Qaeda in some kind of marginal way.
And the Taliban, which they didn't used to support, they seem to be closer to now.
The Iranians like to hedge their bets, and they, have a kind of zero-sum perception of the antagonistic relationship with Washington, and so they're willing to work with old adversaries if it in some way disadvantages the United States.
The enemy of my enemy is my friend.
Exactly.
The Revolutionary Guards in Iran, the Revolutionary Guard, what is the influence, do you think, of that group growing?
They're very important, and it's obviously become, I think, central as a pillar of the regime over the course of the past 10 years. But I tend to be careful about the kind of assertions we sometimes hear coming out of Washington that this is now a kind of militarized theocracy or a military government in any way. The supreme leader is the ultimate authority. There are many factions in Iran. The Revolutionary Guard are an important one, but we don't know enough about, the sort of range of opinion that exists within them. We don't know enough about the strategic thinking of the Revolutionary Guard to fully appreciate how they are seeing the world and their own role. So they're important, but they're not the sum total.
What do you believe about engagement with Iran, talking directly with Iran?
I think the more the better. I doubt it will lead us anywhere truly productive in the near term, simply because of the regional flux and because of the tendency of the Iranians to see themselves on the ascendance and as a result be unwilling to make any real concessions. I don't think they're on the ascendance, but I think this is the perception that those sitting in Tehran have as they look across a landscape in which the United States now faces all kinds of new challenges and new responsibilities and new struggles in terms of dealing with different leaders. But without sort of high expectations, I think sometimes that's exactly the moment to try to see what you can get, even if it's in limited areas. And it also provides a process of learning more about the Iranians. It has been really to our own detriment that we've been unable to have any kind of diplomatic relationship for the past 32 years, and that didn't exist during the long struggle with the Soviet Union. We always had a presence, and we always had a sort of fairly robust channel of communications. To understand your enemy, such that they are, you need to be able to spend some time and listen to their views and see if there are places like Afghanistan where there might be some common interests, there might be some ability to work. This was certainly the case really in the early years of the Bush administration between 2001 and 2003. The most important and fruitful negotiations between Washington and Tehran took place, and it's not impossible to imagine that we could find a way to do that in limited fashion.
Speaking about learning about Iran, as you mentioned, you've spent some time there. What attracts you so much about this country?
Oh, it's an amazing place, as I guess you know, because you've been there twice now. So it is truly a beautiful country, one of tremendous sophistication and resources, people who are really interesting and wonderfully hospitable to guests. It is a country that I think is in some ways more American or more familiar to Americans in its public life than much of the rest of the Middle East. If you go particularly to Tehran, which is a really modern city, it doesn't have the kind of dusty sense of millennia of history that Cairo or some of the other historic capitals of the region do. There's a pizza place on every corner. There are young Iranians who are constantly present in public life. And there are women who play every role imaginable in the country. So it is a place that I think is truly one that many Americans would appreciate if they had the opportunity to go there.
Do you get the sense that there might be another attempt at a governmental transformation there?
In terms
of the youth, of the movement, the protest movement, or you think?
Oh, I think Iran is such an incredibly dynamic place, and we're usually the last to know when there's an important kind of internal political development. So I have no doubt that at this moment there are all kinds of groups in Iran that are thinking and moving in all kinds of different directions about where they want to take their politics. And I don't count out even segments of the conservative faction that dominate Iran today, in part because there's so much disarray amongst them, and there are so many different smaller groups within those who run the country. And when you have that kind of competition, it often creates opportunities for reviving a more sensible approach to the world. This is what happened after a really dark period in Iranian history in the late 1980s, when there was tremendous repression and tremendous hardship as a result of the war. You saw so many kind of young revolutionaries become disaffected from the regime, from the revolution, and produce what we call the reform movement. I think it's not improbable that this current really dark period in Iranian domestic political life will produce a similar kind of rebirth, and I guess that's what we're all hoping for.
And finally, why should Americans care about this country with so many countries on their radar screen right now? Why should they care about Iran?
Iran matters because of its natural resources, the third largest reserves of oil and gas in the world. But it also matters because of its centrality in the Islamic and Arab world. Iran is not an Arab country, but it has enormous influence across the Middle East. And its position, its strategic position, located in the kind of heart of Southwest Asia, the borderlands between a sort of growing and dynamic economies in China and India and the rest of Asia, and the traditional home of the heart of the Middle East and Europe. Iran is, I think, the most consequential country in the region, and we've seen that over the course of the past 32 years. I would say I'd hope that the next 32 give Iran an opportunity to be a constructive factor in the region.
Well, thank you very much. I really appreciate your insight on this really important country.
Thank you so much.
You've been listening to a conversation with Suzanne Maloney, a scholar at the Saban Center for Middle East Policy at the Brookings Institution in Washington, D.C. I spoke with Ms. Maloney at the 2011 Sun Valley Writers Conference. I'd like to thank the organizers of that conference and Ms. Maloney for finding time in her schedule for our interview. Now, I also spoke with her about the 2 American hikers who were held hostage in Iran. They hadn't been released yet, but she predicted they would be. If you'd like to hear that web extra or any of our dialogue programs, please go to our website at idahoptv.org and click on Dialogue. We're on Facebook and Twitter too. For Dialogue, I'm Marcia Franklin.
Presentation of Dialogue on Idaho Public Television is made possible through the generous support of the Laura Moore Cunningham Foundation, committed to fulfilling the Moore family's legacy of building the great state of Idaho.